Erin. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of ioby, which stands for In Our Backyards. Like Rachel said, we're a civic tech organization focused on supporting residents who are stepping into civic life. And we do this by encouraging resident leaders, building their confidence and making the experience of leading a neighborhood project easier and fun. We know that there's a ton of barriers to civic participation, and some of the main barriers that we address are lack of funding, which we address by providing fundraising, coaching, and a crowdfunding platform, and a lack of 501c3 status, which we address by providing type C-ish fiscal sponsorship. We've provided these services for the last decade, working primarily with small organizations and grassroots groups. For ioby in general, about 40% of the groups that we serve are what we call the deep roots, which are groups without 501c3 status, no paid staff, and 100% of their annual budget is raised through ioby. And about 50% of the groups that we work with are grassroots, or they're the ones who can qualify to file a 990 EZ and have annual budgets between $25,000 and $2 million. ioby leaders identify about half, 52% of ioby leaders identify as white, 23% identify as Black or African American, 8.5% Asian American, and 5.2% are Hispanic or Latinx. So a little like around the breakdown nationally. And actually, interestingly, most ioby leaders are actually women, which isn't really well represented on this specific panel of ioby leaders. Today, we're going to talk specifically about ioby's work in mutual aid over the last 14 months. And I'm really grateful to Taisha for her presentation earlier today on the fundamental principles of mutual aid and solidarity. And I just want to underscore a few that she mentioned. So mutual aid is an ancient practice, and we see it in histories of oppressed groups in the US. Mutual aid works to meet survival needs and a sharing understanding about why people do not have what they need. Mutual aid mobilizes people in solidarity to build movements. Mutual aid projects are participatory and collective, and mutual aid can come in a lot of different forms. On ioby specifically, mutual aid groups have delivered food, pantry items, PPE, rent assistance, direct cash assistance, air conditioners, community fridges, care boxes, all sorts of different things. And we're going to just talk about two specific instances here. ioby has a long history of supporting local sharing economies, whether that's a tool library, a book library, a time bank, anything that is sort of grounded in these ideas of mutual sharing and mutual care. Many of them are grounded in the queer disability movement as like offshoots from Black Panthers work, or even in concepts of permaculture. And ioby's been working with groups like this for a really long time. So it was easy for us to understand the structures and the constraints of the groups as many emerged last year. ioby's designed to be responsive to community needs. So our work last year around this time was to adapt our services to the needs of the groups we were serving. I've been doing a sort of series on mutual aid at the Giving Summit this year. My last session featured Alyssa Dizon from Bed-Stuy Strong, which Taisha mentioned as a case study earlier today. That was focused on the technologies and the principles of mutuality. And on May 18th, I'll be bringing Bed-Stuy Strong back again with two co-collaborators from that group, Hadass Wade and Sarah Matthews, as well as leaders from the Astoria Mutual Aid Network and Brownsville, East New York Mutual Aid, to talk specifically about the issues of financial transactions, fiscal sponsorship, payments, disbursements, tax liability, compliance, and risk. That's for next time. But today, for our session on equity, I wanted to focus on the why of mutual aid, how we got here, and how unsurprising it is that an ancient structure practiced by oppressed groups would have so much strength in the last year. ioby projects are led by residents, so each project is designed for the specific needs of that community or neighborhood. So the panelists today are coming from very different communities, and their approaches are really different. And in some cases, they may differ on their theories of mutual aid as well and how they identify. But I want to start off just by sort of framing an issue to Middletown Mutual Aid, to Dimitri and Kirk. We've, in preparation for this, discussed at length the critical importance of understanding the why of mutual aid and not just the what. that mutual aid is not just neighbors helping one another or providing groceries, but it's also an understanding of why food insecurity exists. Several months ago, KQED did an article about a startup tech company that set up community fridges around the Bay Area. The KQED food writer and columnist Ruth Jabrisis described the moment last spring where there was like food insecurity showing up in a lot of different ways: long food lines at banks, kids depending on school lunches that were no longer available, people being worried about high exposure to COVID at grocery stores, groceries running out of critical items like bread and milk. And mutual aid, grounded in community care, collective survival, giving and receiving, being hyper specific and responsive, had a deep understanding of the needs of the community and why that need existed. So the story was all about this startup tech company that had this goal of addressing food insecurity and like in their framing, what would have gone to be food waste. Because food pantries often reject food waste because it doesn't meet their standards. So the reporter here, Ruth Jabrisis, discussed in the article is that like scale and publicity and profit motives were part of the for-profit tech company setting up this community fridge. And despite the sincerity of the people involved in this company, which was obviously like a core part of their motivation for setting up this community fridge, the author of this piece really wanted to focus on, rather than focusing on how this company could help, how could the company instead ask itself, what are you willing to give up as a company to ensure that people are not food insecure, as a way of sort of like reframing why you can't just have a for-profit tech company sort of like set up the same structures as mutual aid. And so I wanted to start there to ask Kirk and Dimitri from Middletown Mutual Aid to talk a little bit about your work and why it's so important to like come first with the principles of mutual aid in the work that you're doing.
Yes, thank you, Erin. So one of the things that we characterize when we talk about why we need mutual aid is the sort of the state of current support systems, right? Mutual aid perhaps could have been unnecessary in many communities, except for the collapse of the existing safety nets. And despite so many different governmental efforts, which were all partially say were delayed or were insufficient to really meet the needs of the populations most affected, mutual aid becomes a form of triage in these moments. And we know that we can rely on each other in these greater times of need than we can on external systems. And so it's really two parts. It's indicative of the strength of a community, and it's also indicative of the weakness of the existing systems, because the underpinnings that allow for things like philanthropy to exist are the same reasons we're experiencing some collapsing, right? So we have to be able to identify, I guess, in our own ways. I don't speak for everyone within our group. Clearly, I wouldn't think anyone would think I'm doing that either, I would hope. But we all, have this sort of one common understanding that, we are stronger together. So this has been also informed by, many of the people within our group's learnings of the history of the Black Panthers and their successes within the communities that they worked in, building, I believe, breakfast and lunch programs for the youth, and also in, I'm going to say, dare to say, they had weapons training, they had arms training, right? Because it was self-defense, a general committee for self-defense, right? So this is a reality of different aspects of mutual aid. It's not strictly limited to a community fridge, or as we had great success with in large part due to ioby, cash assistance program. The cash assistance program is great, but again, it becomes only like a bandage, right? But sometimes especially with the case of the non-essential shutdown. So in Connecticut, we had a 3-month non-essential business shutdown, right? Nobody wants to use the Band-Aid, but if you have to, you're gonna do it, right? You're gonna stop that bleeding if you can. You're not gonna just be like, oh, whoops, oh well, right? And like ride it out. No. So I'm gonna pass over to Kirk with that.
So I love what you said, Dimitri, and I wanted to highlight 2 parts of it. The first one, I think, gets to the root of what you're saying, which is holistic, which we try our best not to just treat the symptoms. That's always going to be first because that's always the immediate need, but we go into this work understanding that housing insecurity, food insecurity, any other effect of poverty all lean on each other and add to a total burden on somebody. The second thing that I think is important to our group specifically is the non-hierarchical nature of how we set things up and how we deal with anything and everything. It makes all the difference in dealing with people, because to be honest, when we started this summer with the community fridge, people were hesitant. The community that was taking from the fridge wouldn't even approach the people who were filling it. And that bothered me personally when I was doing it, because I've lived in this community my whole life. In other contexts, I know these people, but there was this invisible wall and these lines that the person receiving the aid didn't want to cross. And it made it very difficult because they're the community. They had the information we need to do this better. And it took a little bit of building and a little bit of warming up until we could have conversations. But once those conversations started, that's what we needed. That's all the information. I have specific things that I put in the fridge because somebody, and it took courage. You could tell they were a little bit nervous to say these things, but they asked. And because I'm just one person, it's not a whole chain of command. It was very easy to say, oh, you want something to drink. Okay, on my time when I'm filling the fridge, there will never not be bottled water, something there to drink, because I know that's going to mean something to the people who are going there. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Dimitri?
And I think one thing I would maybe sort of close with, I don't know how much we have left for time, but one of the things that we noticed too, or that I noticed personally, is it's interesting what the community cares about, right? So I would have thought, if you had asked me, and I would have thought if people started publishing information about a community fridge in their Facebook group that is just about your town, that people would have been very excited about it and you get a lot of response. And we did get some, and it was nice. But it's nothing compared to the talk about the new donut shop, for example. So we still have some battles to do about like what is important to people, or like what is irrelevant to your community. So people within the community are happy to complain about the situation with homelessness, for example, giving really biased views of what they know about homelessness, right, in our own community. Yet, if you ask them to turn around and look at some things to do anything about it, like they would not, right? But they would love to complain. So I guess like the point of all that is like there still is a lot of hearts and minds work to do. Like, I was hoping, right, that like, oh, like you're doing a great thing, and it's going to naturally just be that great of a thing. But I don't know if the vast populace is ready yet, or even understands. And so I think that when I say doing some hearts and mind work, like education, it's kind of like bringing the praxis along and saying, you know, hey, like this is why, or like this is why it's needed. This is why it's different. This is why we're differentiating from charity, right? Our group falls into the deep roots category that Erin described. We do not have any funding other than our own fundraising work. And can you still hear me? All right. Lost my video here somehow.
Yeah, we can still hear you fine.
Sorry. The point, right? That hearts and mind work is really important. Like connecting to the community, finding out what they think is important, what they want, right?
Dimitri and Kirk, there's a question here about how you worked with the Wesleyan students. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So all right. So Wesleyan is a huge part of the community of Middletown, Connecticut. It's plopped right into the center of town. A lot of stuff is built off of it. There's a lot of give and take between the city, its public school system, and Wesleyan and its systems in general. There's an organization called NEAT, the North End Action Team, which Dimitri sits on the board of, and they have a branch within Wesleyan called WestNEAT, and through WestNEAT, student activists are working with the community, and it became a lot of the same people. And when Middletown Mutual Aid got started in the summer, a lot of them joined and became a huge part of the backbone of organization, collective. And through the specific things that they have access to as Wesleyan students, a lot of the work has been a lot easier to get little logistical details done. That I have it.
And as far as the hearts and minds work that I was describing, I would say I think a lot of that mutual aid work, a lot of the differentiation that is present in mutual aid work is making one-on-one connections, taking the time, especially if people within the community say, like, we had complaints about the fridge, not by people who were actively using it, but live nearby. This NIMBY kind of attitude, right? Oh, it's causing this or it's causing that. So instead of dismissing them or I don't know what's going on with this thing. Sorry, guys. Instead of dismissing them or saying like, your concerns aren't valid, like, we try to have productive conversations and understand why they're upset enough to complain or whatnot, and just, you know, having those interactions where you at least get to you're in more context. It's more of a we have more exposed surface to the community. Does that make sense? I think a really good way to think. We intentionally create more exposed surface to the community, whether it's people on site filling the fridge and interacting with people coming to get food, or whether it's like one-on-one outreach, helping people who are homeless, who need toiletries, or things of that realm, whatever it is. So yeah, that's about that.
That's great. Actually, on that point about intentionally creating exposed surfaces to the community, and earlier what Kirk said about the invisible wall between those like receiving aid and the community, I think one of the things that I noticed from that was really a commonality among many of the mutual aid groups that IOB worked with in the last year is just that their really strong emphasis on listening to community needs. Um, and I think Angelo's work at Ohio City Riverview Care is a really great example of that. Um, Angelo, I know that your co-collaborator Malaz was going to join us tonight, and she isn't able to be here with us right now. So I hope that you don't mind speaking on behalf of the entire group. One of the other things that I've noticed is that co-collaborators in mutual aid refuse to speak on behalf of the entire group at all at every single opportunity. Um, but Angelo, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, the grounding that you and Malaz have had in different forms of mutual aid from like respective backgrounds, and also just the ways that your focus on listening to community and being in close relationship with the community members allowed you to be adaptive to those community needs.
Sure, thanks, Erin. I will agree that I cannot speak for the entire group that helped, but I will try and channel the energy and love that went into it all. So I guess just as some background, in Ohio City, we're a very dense neighborhood here in Cleveland, and there are some higher income streets, there are lower income streets, and they're like right next to each other. It's a very mixed community, and Riverview Tower is a 500 resident public housing residence that's just down the street. Malaz El-Jamiabi, one of my partners in this, and I both live on the same street. We're neighbors. We have already like a lot of relationships with residents and our neighbors at Riverview. When the COVID pandemic hit, Ohio was one of the first states that kind of went into a total lockdown. We were also one of the first to have mask mandates. And when this all started to happen, we all like immediately realized, you know, this is early April, that many of our neighbors at Riverview were making 1 to 2 item trips to the grocery store, 1 to 2 item trips to get food, trying to get toilet paper that was already like sold out of stores. So and then also isolated because everyone is in like lockdown mode. And if you're an older person, perhaps living by yourself, that can be incredibly isolating. So it was through speaking with these neighbors and learning what their needs were, like just boredom was a big thing, you know, the basic essentials. So what we did was we wanted to approach it from just a place of care. So we designed this care package. We, with ioby's help, tried to formulate like a budget, tried to figure out how can we rapidly get these items and supplies in the hands of the people who would benefit most from it. And we raised like $8,000 in 18 hours. Like it was really the community coming together and realizing, hey, we all share this space. We need to lock down and like get a hold on this situation as quickly as possible. And through some of that design, this care package was also co-designed and by the residents of Riverview, and just helping us figure out what are the greatest needs. And there was a level of planning, but it had to be done like in real time. Like we just could not stop and wait and think about solving every detail. We just kind of had to go. We just had to buy like $1,500 worth of canned goods and just hope that it would all work out, that we'd be able to find bags for them. It was definitely an iterative process. And I hope that we can like talk maybe a little bit more about how ioby was helpful in that, and some of the challenges that small, rapidly formed mutual aid little groups encounter, and transferring money from the people who want to contribute to the people who can convert that into some good or service or item. And ioby was really helpful in that. Fiscal sponsorship has been mentioned out there. Also, like the fees that go into that. All of these are things that we all have to think about. And sometimes this tech space is productive in removing those barriers. And sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they create more headaches. So that's kind of the intro to the project that Malaz and I and a few others worked on, and happy to have some follow-up questions to help guide where to take my part of the conversation next.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Angelo. So I think that this is the time for us to have a little discussion, and we can ask questions directly of some of these co-collaborators. But Rachel,